as I mentioned before, I'm starting to record the meetings. Hopefully that's not the reason why we're having smaller groups, but I haven't really given the links yet. Although there's Ruben. So today's July 21st, Wednesday, roughly about 6 o'clock, 2021. How to work a file, and I'll tell you, at the final thoughts, I do mention a handout. I didn't send that handout out yet, but I will send it out later on tonight, maybe after the meeting, or possibly on next week's email. Let me know if you didn't get the handout, but it does reference these two parts, how to work a file. I came up with this as an overview because we talked about very specific things when it comes to contracts, when it comes to disclosures, when it comes to reports, but now just getting into the how-to. This is kind of a superficial overview of, when you get into a transaction. So I had some individuals asking me to do something like this some years back. And so there might be a little bit older information in here, but it's roughly the same. It really doesn't change much. There might be some people logging in a few minutes or so, but let's go and get started. As I mentioned before, there is a handout for this, and like I said, I'll send it out on the email. If you're not on the email list, shoot me over your email. I think you three are on it. There's my information if you need to get a hold of me. If you can, please mute on your side of the presentation, although I do mute you on my end too. And it's primarily just to do away with distractions, dogs, babies, trucks driving by, that kind of thing. Somewhat of a distraction for us on a Zoom meeting. So I appreciate you guys meeting, but feel free to chime in anytime, ask questions. If you have a question, it does help the rest of the class, or you can use the chat as well. I'll try to get to the chat questions at the end of each slide. Okay, and then thank you guys for logging in early. I usually start roughly about 4:50, maybe 4:55 with the real estate show. And I do include that link also in the email that I send out. So, hey, Mr. Robert, how are you, sir? That link is, to YouTube channel, and it shows that I did, and the ones that I'm showing right now was back in 2013. So those of you who came on, I think Ron was on with us there for a little while during the show. That was back in September of 2013. So roughly about 8 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. Still a good show. Still had good information, actually. Some of that information, just never gets old. Some of the same good stuff. So thank you guys for logging in early. And as always, anyone's invited, licensed or not, any age, doesn't matter. There are some teenagers that have logged on and enjoyed. High school people are always good to come on. Now, granted, this is roughly a year's worth of curriculum that we have. So coming on occasion is good. Maybe you want a refresher, what have you. But for the most part, sorry, there's some other people logging on here. For the most part, it is good information to refresh if you're practicing real estate, but also if you're interested in getting your license, it's always good to see what goes on in the background, because quite frankly, most of the stuff that we talk about, you don't get in a regular classroom for real estate. Usually, it's with a brokerage or what have you. And I've been in a lot of those classes, and I'll be honest with you, the content that I am putting together, I've rarely seen in any of the classrooms. So feel free to invite anybody that that might benefit from these classes. It's free. They can, you pretty much watch these in the privacy of your own home, and pretty soon you'll be able to watch them as well by recording. So that said, let's get started. Any questions or comments? All right. So this is part one. This is a two-part presentation. So we'll do part two next week. And so we'll get started with primarily, you write an offer and you get the acceptance. Okay. So there is a confirmation section on the counteroffer, and I will tell you that it's always a good idea that if you're on the listing side to always counter an offer. And the reason why is because the offer usually expires, and the offer, if you're on the listing side, you kind of revive it by using the counter offer, but there's also some information that you can put on a counter offer, kind of like who's the escrow and also who's the title company. You can put those people in with their phone number, so you can avoid a buyer's agent potentially trying to take their time, maybe putting the earnest money deposit in and that kind of thing. Okay, so typically when an offer is accepted, it means simply that it's been executed by all parties, and there is a confirmation at the bottom of the counteroffer, right? That you want to confirm as the buyer's agent, right? So that later on in the presentation, I also talk about utilities. Now, if you're an aggressive agent, and I always stress certain aggressive behaviors, okay? That if you get an offer accepted, you can verbally tell the listing agent, hey, make sure all the utilities are on it, because once that offer is accepted, the clock starts ticking on the contract. Because remember, contracts expire, contingencies expire. There are time frames on a contract, so you want to use every second to, in terms of representing your client, you want to use every second to aggressively negotiate their contract. And at the end of the day, having the utilities on is one of them. So imagine if you want to go out and do an inspection on the property tomorrow and the utilities are on, right? So this is the reason why you want to say those things. The other reason why is because if the utilities aren't on and they tell you, oh, you know what, they won't be on for a couple days, okay? That gives you the opportunity to negotiate more time. You want to tell the listing agent, okay, well, Mr. Listing Agent, you only wanted to give us 10 days for inspection. So guess what? You know what? Can you give us a couple extra days now, because you're taking some of our time? So this is a little nugget, if you will. I always talk about the little nuggets that you can do, or that you can use to your benefit and to your client's benefit. Okay. So so pretty much when you're working with a buyer, okay, typically the financial piece is the first piece of the puzzle. So before you're even submitting offers to listing agents, typically you are already have an approval, you already have proof of funds, you already have most likely you have their FICO scores, because you know what the lender is going to require. Okay. So on the buyer side, if you're on the buyer side and you get an offer accepted, typically you already have that taken care of. Okay. But sometimes if you're on the buyer side, you don't have the escrow information. So you're typically collecting that information and also giving it to the lender, but you also want to present yourself, or I don't know why I can't think of the word. You want to introduce yourself to the escrow officer, typically by email, right? And then most of us have a transaction coordinator that we work with, or somebody of compliance that works in your brokerage that you want to give the information to as well, because you want to get them started on their process. Typically, they're looking at timelines. They're adding things to their list. They're putting everybody that's involved in the transaction onto a list, so you have that information readily available. And then obviously you want to open escrow. Opening escrow simply means is that typically the seller is choosing the escrow company. Now we've talked about RESPA 9, where the buyer actually has Well, let's see, Robert, you can't hear me? Robert's saying you can't hear me. Robert, can you hear me or you can't hear me? I think I'm not muted. I'm assuming everyone else can hear me. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Yeah, everybody can hear me, Rob. It's probably on your end, dude. Take a look. I'm sorry, Ben. Yeah, I know, Ben. I apologize because I'm reading the chat here. It shows up as Ruben Durant, but like I said, I know it's you, Ben. Thank you. But anyway, I'll get back to the opening escrow part. The information typically, and we find this often where the listing agents and the sellers want their escrow companies, they want the seller's choice typically. And we talked about res benign, that the buyers have the right to choose a settlement service. But usually they relinquish that that ability to have an escrow just to get the deal, right? You don't want to kill a deal over an escrow company. But there are different kinds of escrow companies. So you have DRE escrows, which are Department of Real Estate escrows that operate under a brokerage license. And then you have Department of Business Oversight that operate under an escrow license number or escrow officer license number. So they are different. And the licensed escrow officer is also insured. So there's a little bit of a difference there in terms of what's happening. But collecting that information, a lot of times, you know, as a buyer, sometimes on the buyer side, sometimes like pulling teeth. So you want to collect that information, you want to deliver the earnest money deposit and receipt, and get that information over to the escrow company. Make sure that you're available. You answer your phone and or emails, and that's important to communicate with them because they're simply have a job to do and they simply just want to get it done, right? And then the next part is to start up with your inspections and reports. And this is where we talked about asking the listing agent to make sure that the utilities are on, because you have, or I've had situations where, you know, I've had to wait a few days, you know, because their water wasn't on or the electricity wasn't on. Sometimes appraisers and or inspectors won't go out until they know that that's there, you know, that stuff is available, right? Because if not, they got to go back because they're checking on those things, right? So anyway, any questions or comments on that? So this is just a quick overview, and we'll be talking a little bit more in depth on some of these. So let's keep moving. Any questions or comments?
Nothing still, Mom.
No.
No.
All right. So Robert, I can hear you, sir. But I'll meet you guys. Okay.
The host muted everyone. I was just testing something.
Huh?
The host muted me, but I wasn't.
Yeah. I'm muting everybody just because I mute you guys on my end. But did you have a question? All right. Here we go. So making the offer, right? So listing or selling site, right? These are the forms typically that you would see, and I'm using acronyms. If you guys are not familiar with any of those acronyms, let me know, and I'll let you know what they are. But like I mentioned before, I'm recording this. You can always go back and take a look at it, but you're also welcome to take pictures. Okay, so whereas we can continue moving on with the class. So the idea is that each of these has a lot of very specific verbiage, because we're not going over each of these in terms of what their content is. It's more about just the form itself. So in terms of the agency disclosures, you know, there's the AD, that's the real estate agency relationship, PRBS, possible representation of more than one buyer and seller, WFA, which is a wire fraud advisory, FHDA, which is the fair housing, which is a fairly new disclosure, and the CCPA, which is a privacy disclosure. Okay, and these are just advisories and disclosures that are usually signed by the client, and they usually come in the offer pack. So if you go into zip forms, you do RPA CA on zip forms. These are usually included in that packet, as well as the BIA, which is in the second line down, which is buyer's inspection advisory. So these are things now, and I've talked about before, and I kind of created this, the three pillars, right? We have statutory, which means by law. We have contractual, which means obviously items that are contractual. And then we have civil, which are things that are more liable to a broker, okay? And the majority of these things are one of those three, if not all of them, right? So when we're talking about, let's say the AD, the agency relationship, that's more contractual and also civil. It's not necessarily required by law, but these are things that we do as a business practice, okay? So these are forms that typically you would see in a offer. And on the advisory disclosure part now, these are more transaction specific. So when we talk about REO, the REO form is used when you're dealing with a foreclosure property, or the SSA, which is more for short sale properties, right? The PAK is for probate properties, and then TA, which is a trust advisor, you're dealing with the trust properties. And then now PED, which is actually not even in the system anymore, we were using that more for the coronavirus addendum, right? Although it's not even there anymore. All the coronavirus forms are gone off of the ZIP forms. And then there's the contracts, obviously. So we have the RPA, the income purchase agreement, the probate purchase agreement, commercial purchase agreement. All of those are actually contracts that were made by the California Association of Realtors, attorneys, and over the years they continue to update them. I remember they used to be 2 pages back, I think it was in the 80s, early 90s, and now they're 10 pages. Some of them, like the RIPA, are 11 or 12 or even 13 pages long, okay? And it's primarily because, people have gotten very litigious, and it's covering things so we get an understanding of what the contracts are about. And again, we're not going over what each one has in it. We're just really doing an overview of what should be included when you are potentially listing a property and or when you are making an offer, okay? And then we have the contract addendums or addenda, okay? Now the CBC is somewhat abated. It's not something you use often, mainly because the CBC verbiage is on page 10 of the RPA. I think it's section D, if I remember correctly. And it talks about the agent's commissions or the buyer's agent's commissions. Now, if you're going to modify those commissions, or you're not a member of the MLS for whatever reason, you would use the CBC, okay? It has now been updated to 2 pages, which it used to be 1 page, but the CBC, again, is abated. You don't normally use it, but these are contract addenda that now you can add just depending on your transaction. So you have the PAA, which is a purchase agreement addendum, which can talk about various things like rent backs and different items that aren't included in the regular contract. And these are things that you would, that addendum gives you the ability to, sorry, logging somebody in here. That addendum gives you the ability to add those things. Okay, so obviously the SCO and the SMCO are counteroffers along with the BCO, right, which is a buyer counteroffer. Those are also addenda to the original contract. And then there's actually an ADM, or just the addendum, right? Or you have the SIP, which the seller in possession. So this is a form that you would use in the event that the seller wishes to remain on the property for less than 30 days. And it talks about the terms and conditions. It talks about it has the verbiage on it necessary to protect the buyer, who after closing is the owner of the property, and it's important to use. And then we have the representative capacity, which is the RCSD. Anytime you're dealing with a person that is the owner of an LLC, a corporation, a trust, that kind of thing, okay, somebody that is representing another organization, you need representative capacity. So that's an addenda to the contract. That's the RCSD. The COP is when a buyer needs to sell a property and it's contingent upon them selling the property, right? Again, another addenda to the contract. And then the SPRP, which is now the seller needs to find a replacement property, right? So these are all different addenda that you would put onto any of these other contracts. So these four categories, if you will, would be all inclusive to any offers that you make on a property and or any offers you would receive if you happen to be the listing agent, right? And it talks about so you're kind of linking things together, if you will. You're taking care of the advisories and disclosures. You're taking care of the different verbiage that's required. Like, let's say if you're dealing with a trust, the verbiage that's required in the contract in terms of terms and conditions, price, timeframes, financing, contingencies, that kind of thing, right? And then anything additional that needs to be disclosed and or talked about. Like, say the listing agent is related to the seller, you would use an addendum. You have the seller needs to find a replacement property. You would use a different addenda, right? So these are all the forms. So again, I'm using acronyms, and I will be giving out a handout to these things, allowing you guys that if you're not exactly familiar with the acronyms, you can go back and look at zip forms and you can pull those up and read them and find out what they are. I use them every day, so that's why I know what they are by acronym. Not all of them, I wish I did, but I don't. There's probably 300 different ones that CARD uses, but for the most part, this is a segmented overview as an example of what you might encounter, right, when dealing with a transaction, either on the listing side or on the buyer side. Okay, so these are things that aren't required. Okay, the copy of the earnest money deposit, and they're not they are required for the broker file, but not when you're first opening a file. Okay, and these are things that you will find on a listing that a listing agent will put, like, say, on the private remarks and say, okay, we need these things in order to accept your offer. So understand that they're not required, but recommended, because if you're going to be combative with them and say, well, these things aren't required, they may just not even talk to you. So it's about having a little bit of diplomacy, but understand that there's nothing statutory about these items. So copy of the earnest money deposit, it's not required, but they all ask for it, right? Proof of funds, they all ask for it. Copy the FICO scores, right? I've even had agents say, I need a copy of their credit report. Now, understand, folks, and I talk about it here on the next line, that we as agents are not allowed to give out confidential information. So guess what? The credit report is confidential information. You cannot give that out and shouldn't ever give it out, okay? In terms of proof of funds, make sure that you are blacking out account numbers, okay? You can have their name on, you can have the last four of the account number, last three of the account number, that's fine. But the full account numbers, always black them out, okay? Don't ever email that information out to an agent. Highly recommended not to. Understand that on the AD, the real estate agency disclosures very specifically talks about that. It's on section C of the agency relationship that talks about that you are obligated not to divulge confidential information. So understand that what a lot of agents are asking for is a copy of the FICO score page, right? They're asking for a copy of the FICO score page, which is a part of the credit report. It's not the whole credit report. So understand the difference, okay? Copy of the loan approval letter. A lot of us call that it's like an underwriting form that they use, right? DU approval, I think is what they call it. There's different names for it, right? If the deal is being financed, and as I mentioned before, never deliver originals or confidential info. Remember, you are representing your client, and you're not supposed to be giving them confidential information. But in the act of diplomacy, again, because these things are not required, we sometimes divulge this information because we want them to accept our offer. And that's typically when we're on the buyer side. The items mentioned as not required or recommended for most agents to consider your offer viable. Please note section 3H and 3J, right, of the RPA have boxes, right, to indicate these items. So if you look here, when we're talking about 3H, the buyer is or should deliver proof of funds of what they're saying is going to be their down payment, and also their earnest money deposit. It should cover that, okay? Whether or not that verification is attached. So if you check that box, and I know earlier I talked about it not being required, if you check the box, now it became contractual. Now you're saying that you're going to give that to it. So now it becomes contractual, right? So now it is required, okay? And now the same thing for the loan application and the DU approval, okay? If you check that box right there on 3J, what you're saying to the listing agent and the seller is that you're going to divulge that information at some point. And in this case, you can see it says shall within 3 days after the acceptance deliver that. Now, if you include it with your offer, that means that you would check these boxes and that now it's included with the offer. So you're pretty much telling them, hey, Mr. Agent, you know, I included that with it. All right. Any questions or comments on that? All right, moving right along. And just for the record, there is 19 slides. We're on slide number 5 right now. It's 6:28. Just to kind of give you some bearings on time. I do tend to get a little bit more long-winded on these, mainly because there's a lot of explanation that goes along with it. But we should move pretty quickly. There's some lighter slides coming up. Make sure so offer gets accepted, right? Section 32, which is on page 10, right? Make sure to receive executed contracts, all signature lines endorsed. Oh, and let me add, because it's not I'm not on the presentation. Let me add, all signature lines are endorsed and dated. Because remember, it's not executed unless you have both of those criteria, signed and dated by all parties. Pay close attention to page 10 at this stage. Be sure to ask the listing agent to turn on all utilities. So there, I say it again, to the property if you are on the buyer side, unless otherwise agreed. The importance of checking boxes is paramount to transaction as to lead the reader to any additional contractual agreements. So let's not take the boxes for granted, because a lot of times that can mean the difference between getting tenant estoppels and not getting tenant estoppels, getting possession of the property at closing and not getting possession of the property at closing. So these are little boxes that are meant to mean something. And when we get into the RPA presentation, we talk about all that in depth, okay? So initially by the seller confirms the offer has been accepted by the seller, right? So the section that I'm talking about, so section 32, right? If you look and let me see if I put an arrow in there. I don't know if I did. So the seller signs it here and dates it, okay? That indicates offer exceptions. And there's Mr. Larry. And then also, so let me back up a bit. If they simply just accept your offer, okay, there's no reason to check the box, which is right underneath the 32 that you see on the screen, where it says if checked, seller's acceptance is subject to attached counteroffer, okay? But if they do give you a counteroffer, make sure that that box is checked and then it's dated the date of the counteroffer, because if it's not, it leads the reader, and typically the reader is, after you close a transaction, the reader is an auditor from the DRE, okay? That is a violation if it's not filled out. So I don't know if I highlighted it or not. Let's see what I did here. And I'll get to this other part in a second. Oh, okay, yeah, this one here, that box right there with the top yellow arrow, okay? That box should be checked if there's a counteroffer, and then right underneath it, there should be a date if there's a counteroffer. And so that would make your contract executed. Now, let's go down to the bottom yellow arrow, okay? If there isn't a counteroffer and that top box is not checked, right? The buyer can authorize in this section here, okay? And actually, let me annotate because I just want to make sure you guys are catching on here real quick. So the buyer can annotate right here or initial right here. Once they receive the offer back signed by the seller, this is where the buyer can confirm the acceptance. Now, they don't have to, okay? They don't have to confirm the acceptance, okay? But this is where they can confirm the acceptance, okay? So this is important, and the reason why I say it's important is because I find that on like 97% of the time, this activity is not happening, okay? And mainly because I'll get a accepted offer, and then that box isn't checked, and there's no date there, but yet there's a counter offer. So how do I know that the counter offer is even exists unless they check that box? They're leading the reader to the fact that there isn't a counter offer, and to me that's a problem. So any questions or comments on that? All right, let's move right along here. So again, that was page 10, section 32, okay? So getting information for escrow. So usually listing agent will have the information depending on the agreement. It is important that you deliver your DRE and previously BRE, personal information, license and public ID of the listing agent, so that MLS may be changed depending or active under contract status. The escrow information should follow. So the escrow officer's name, email address, phone number, and address. Now, you can, if you're the listing agent, you can search the buyer's agent information. There is a search section. If you have their license number, and typically it's on the PRBS and it's also on the contract, and then you can search it and you can fill out their name. So you don't necessarily need their public ID to fill it out. But what I found in the past was, because agents do kind of jump around a bit, what I found is that it's always best to at least kind of know it if you can. And that's because a lot of times they'll come up 3 or 4 times from 3 or 4 different boards. So it gives you the opportunity to ask them, hey, which one do you want it under, right? And sometimes they're very specific about what company they want it under, and it's always best to know. So just be mindful of the fact that if you're on the listing side, you kind of want to know what their public ID is. So when you're inputting it in the listing and changing it to pending or active under contract, it gives you the ability to put the right information in it. If for whatever reason the listing agent does not have this information, you obviously cannot open escrow without it. And that's because there's a possibility that maybe they're not licensed, or maybe they don't belong to a board. This is information that you need to know in order to do it, right? And obviously you need the escrow information if you're on the buyer's side, because then you really can't even deliver the wire. I would recommend covering this information in writing on a counter offer. So if you're on the listing agent side, I always recommend putting on who the escrow company is going to be. And what I mean by that is the name of the escrow officer and their phone number. Because I've had buyer's agents tell me this: oh, Alex, you never gave me the escrow officer's information. And I said, excuse me, sir, it's on the counter offer. So they can't say that. It doesn't, you know, they're going to feel really stupid, right? And I'm not trying to make them feel stupid. Don't get me wrong. What I'm trying to get accomplished here is let's not play games, right? I gave you the escrow information. There's the phone number. That's enough to at least get a hold of them. If you need an email address, you want wire instructions, you need to give them your email address. The phone number is there. So that's on the listing side. So if you're dealing with a listing agent that gives you that information, you can't play with them with that game with them as the buyer's agent, right? So this is why I recommend that you put that on a counter offer, including the title information, right? Always email requests as verbal requests leave no proof of inquiry. That's important, guys. What I always talk about, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove, right? So very important to use email and also archive your emails to prove the conversation, because you have people that will claim that they never got it, they never said it, that kind of thing. And if you have an email, it's like, excuse me, but it says it right here. Any questions or comments?
Good to know, Alex.
Okay, Mr. Robert, you finally got it working, huh? Right on. Well, that's good. I'm glad you guys came on. So let's do a quick pop quiz, okay? This is your opportunity to unmute. So can a file be held up if the listing agent fails to deliver the escrow information? Anybody?
I'll be if the listing agent.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, sure it can. But what can you do about it, right? You can deliver it yourself, right? If you know if the again, if they're saying seller's choice, right? You potentially could force the issue. But here's the other point is if this happens, remember that because you're on a time frame, and a lot of times they're trying to rush you into your inspection contingencies and all that kind of stuff. Renegotiate that time frame. Hey, dude, you didn't give me the escrow information for a few days, right? And if they're giving you 10 days for inspections, there's no reason why you can't, force that issue. So why would a listing agent do that? Any idea? Well, why would a listing agent not want to divulge the escrow information?
As a backup offer.
Man,
Wants the other to fall.
Yeah, he's hoping that you cancel because he's got a backup offer. A lot of times, it happens. It has to do more with dual agency because it's their deal, right? So a lot of times they'll do that. Guess what? You have them under contract. There's no way that seller can cancel, guys. The only way the seller can cancel is if the buyer doesn't perform. And at the end of the day, it's a non-seller performance if they don't give you that information because they're required to, right? So don't let an agent play that game with you, okay? So I always recommend addressing the escrow and title information either on the actual offer or on the counter offer. And again, most of the time we're writing seller's choice on an offer, right? And doing that, remember, it takes away your ability, if you want to negotiate fees, right? Because you're telling the seller it's their choice, right? And also to negotiate who the escrow is. So, sometimes we don't have that power to do that because we don't want to lose the deal, understood? But there are things that you can do in order to protect yourself. And
Now say it, Mom.
I'm sorry?
What is the right thing to do?
Well, there really isn't a right or wrong thing to do. It really has to do with really more with just kind of judging the situation, right? So they can say this probably so many different transactions, you do things differently on every transaction and you're just kind of feeling it out. But what I recommend on the listing side is that you put the escrow information on the counteroffer. What I recommend on the buyer side is that you recommend instead of putting seller's choice and you're concerned about the listing agent possibly playing games with you, right? Put an escrow company on the offer. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to counter you back and say, no, we want it to be this escrow. So guess what? They just told you who the escrow was. Does that make sense? So if you write, because we're so accustomed to write seller's choice that it kind of leaves it open to where now they don't have to say anything. But if you say, oh no, I want it to be escrow today, and I'm just using an X escrow, right? They have to respond on a counteroffer. Does that make sense? Any other questions or comments on that? All right, so let's keep moving here. We're on slide number 8. So we're kind of halfway through 641. So opening escrow usually performed by the listing agent, deliver required information to the agreed to escrow for processing. May contact and deliver your office and contact information to the escrow officer, typically done by email, right? Escrow operates by instruction only. And those words right there are very powerful, okay? Escrow does not operate by verbal instructions. And sometimes I have to remind escrow agents of that because, you know, a lot of times the escrow companies that we deal with, they're dealing with comrades and colleagues that are in their office because sometimes they're in the same office and they've done multiple transactions together. So they know each other. So when they're talking amongst themselves, you know, they forget. So a lot of times I've had to tell escrow agents when they talked about commissions or they talked about terms and conditions, and I would ask them, well, where did you get that information? They said, oh, well, the agent told me. And I would have to remind them, excuse me, Mr. or Mrs. Escrow agent, you do not operate on verbal instruction. And then they kind of step back and say, oh, you're right. It's got to be in writing. And guess what? Us as agents, we're not even in the transaction. Look at page 10 of the RPA, letter A of the RPA says that agents and brokers are not part of the agreement between the buyer and seller. Buyer and seller are the ones that are making these agreements and agreeing to terms and conditions, right? And it has to be in writing and it has to be executed. We've talked about all that, right? So escrow operates by instruction only. So delivery of the contract executed by all parties is paramount because that's what's telling escrow what to do. Escrow instructions simply mimic the actual contract and give escrow time frames, terms and conditions of the contract to appropriately execute it. Despite the contract's endorsement by all parties, escrow needs their own contracts endorsed in order to be legally bound. And the reason why is because they're a third party. So this is why they mimic and then add some of their own things. They have general provisions and they have other things that they talk about in escrow. But this is why they mimic the contract and then they have the buyer and seller sign all that too, right? And that's because they're a third party.
Excuse me, what page again?
Okay, so I think you're talking about the last thing that I talked about where it says that brokers are not a part of the agreement between buyer and seller. It's on the RPA or the residential purchase agreement. Well, it's actually on all the agreements, but let's talk about that one specifically. It's page 10, and it's in the box right above, or it's in the box the same where you sign, where the agent signed, okay? And it's letter A, it's the very first one. Are you looking at it right now, Robert?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, and do you see it there? Do you see what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's important because let me tell you something, guys. You know how many times I've told an agent when they're sitting here and they're trying to tell me about this and that, about the contract and you know this and that. And I say, excuse me, sir, but you're not even part of this contract. They're trying to negotiate something, right, that has already been agreed to. And I use escrow fees as an example. You know how many times agents come around and start yelling and screaming about the escrow fees? I remind them, right, that if you want a discount on the escrow fees, write an addendum, have the seller sign it, and have the buyer sign it. And if the seller agrees and the escrow agrees, the seller will sign it. If not, they won't. And do they have to drop their fees if buyer and seller don't agree? They don't, because agents are not a part of that agreement. Does that make sense, guys? Now, it's important because you will find people that think that they can do those things. And I'm telling you this, that if you don't want that to happen, that you can pull rank, right? That's why we're here talking about this stuff. You can pull rank. You're going to say, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Buyer, but my escrow is not going to drop their fees because the seller doesn't agree. You can say that. And guess what? You would be right. And I don't like to talk about wrong and right, but the idea is that it's, you know how I talk about the chessboard and the moving pieces. That's one of those moving pieces, is that the agents and the brokers are not part of the agreement between the buyer and seller. The buyer and seller have agreed, and they will sign, and they will do those things. So this is where it's kind of important. So that's kind of another nugget of the day, right? And then we talked about the escrow having their own agreement now on the side, because they're an unbiased third party. They need something signed by all parties as well, right? And actually, I just answered that last question. Why does escrow need their own executed instructions? That's because they're an unbiased third party to the same contract. They simply just mimic it. And then, because there are things that escrow does as an unbiased third party that is required by an escrow. Any questions or comments on that? Any other questions or comments? All right, so get the deposit check, right? So this is a little bit different than what we're used to, but wiring just seems to be the go-to, and it's also part of the contract. So if wiring is intended, you don't have to fill anything out on I think it's section number 2 of the RPA on page 1. You don't have to fill any of that part out because it already says electronically or electronic funds, which is wiring. Okay, so be sure to get the wire instructions and escrow number from escrow. Have your client visit their bank and wire the funds prior to the expiration date of the contract. Now remember, if you look at section 2 on page 1 of the RPA, it gives them 3 days to do that after the acceptance. Now remember, those are 3 business days. So if it happens to be the weekend, they got a little extra time, because we all know the banks are closed sometimes. Okay, so but be mindful of those timeframes, because sometimes, again, if you don't perform, it gives the seller ability to cancel with the proper notice. Okay, why is this important? Make sure the wire instructions include escrow, the escrow number, address of the property, and the client's name. Right? And that's if room allows. A lot of times wires don't have a lot of room, but you kind of want to tell the person that's wiring it to include all that information. The reason why is because you don't want to lose your money over a small technicality, right? The wire fraud advisory talks about that in terms of, when funds are transferred electronically, they are exposed sometimes to the internet. So this is another reason why you want most of that information on there, because maybe it got misplaced somehow, and it's trackable now with that information. If using a cashier's check, most escrows have a FedEx or courier account, either hand deliver or mail. I've done that before. To escrow, be sure to make a copy of the check before you deliver it. The reason why is because, again, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. If you're going to hand deliver a check to an escrow company, you have a copy of what you handed them, and then also when you get there, ask for a receipt. Right? Is an escrow open without an earnest money deposit received? So they've gotten the contract, they know about you guys, they just haven't received the earnest money deposit yet. Is the escrow considered open?
No.
Okay, well, it is open, okay? Receiving the earnest money deposit check is just part of the process. So I would say that the answer is yes, it is open, but some escrow companies won't act until they receive the earnest money deposit check. So this is why I brought up the question, okay? So in terms of it being technical, right, opened or not opened, who cares, right? But at the end of the day, get that earnest money deposit in as fast as you can. And it's mainly because you don't want the notice to perform. You don't want escrow not doing stuff for you because they're technically opened, but some of them operate differently. And a lot of times it has to do with the earnest money deposit. So even though your answer wasn't incorrect, right? It's mainly because sometimes the escrow companies, just the way they act, right? So any other questions or comments on that? All right, so we're on slide number 9, coming up at 6:51, doing pretty good time. So complete TC information sheet and turn in the file, right? So the file should include copy of the property profile, executed contracts and addendums, and a copy of the active MLS printout. Now, me as a transaction coordinator, I usually get all of this stuff myself. Okay, so just depending on the TC that you're working with, it's important. But all of these things should be part of your file, your broker file. So at the close of a transaction, you should have all of these things in a file. So copy the listing agreement and related items if you're a dual agent or the listing agent. Include any other documents related to the transaction that are additional or extraordinary. Those are the things we talked about. If there's a trust, if they're, the counter offers, if we're talking about the seller has to find a replacement property, all of those things are important because it gives you a full view of what's going on with the transaction. If you're not using a TC, be sure to include those things in your file. Again, it's part of a broker file that is required by the Department of Real Estate for it to be DRE compliant. Some TCs have an information sheet that may include other information like the opposite sites, TC info, title insurance company, home warranty company, and lender information. I would recommend filling one of these out. It's easy to forget this information when looking back at older files, and that's for sure. I mean, you can go back a few months, and if you don't have that information readily available, it's very easy to forget who you were dealing with, right? So whose responsibility is to pull reports and contracts for the TC? And I kind of mentioned that already, so I won't grill you guys on it, but it's the responsibility of the agent. Now, depending on your relationship with your transaction coordinator or somebody who's working with you as an assistant, again, just make sure that it's in the file, right? That should be part of your checklist. The property profile, the copy of the listing printout. Typically, I like to have the active, pending, and closed to show the chain of events that happen. And it's good information, especially when you're looking back and you happen to be auditing a file or you happen to be in the middle of a lawsuit. That again, you have to remember that if you're in the middle of an audit or there's an attorney looking at your file, they're looking for mistakes. They're looking for gaping holes. And if you have this stuff in your file, it gives them nowhere to go, right? I call them ambulance chasers, right? So no disrespect to our legal teams out there. So any questions or comments on that? All right, so let's do quick funny. So how to work a file, right? Any of us that have worked with buyers will find this funny. I found it hilarious when I saw it. I can't believe there was an actual main for real estate agents talked about disclosures, but on section 14 or right above section 14, there's a section that talks about the delivery of disclosures from the seller that they're required to give either statutorily, contractually, or civilly. And if you're the selling agent, you're usually sitting there waiting for these things to come, and the expiration date has already passed and gone, and you're still begging for them, right? Kind of important, if on the same section, which is 14B3, if the seller has not delivered to you the correct or the things that they're obligated to give you as disclosure, it gives you an additional 5 days. So you might want to mark that down. 14B3. Read that paragraph. It's interesting when agents are begging for the contingency removal, but yet it took them an extra 5 days to get you what you needed. And let's say they forgot something, like the avid, or they forgot, the seller's affidavit, right? And I'll be asking them for it, and they can't say that I didn't ask for it because I'm not there to play games with them. But I'll invoke 14B3 just to tell them, hey, you can't ask me to remove contingencies because my buyer's not fully disclosed. Think about it. Can a buyer remove contingencies if they have not been fully disclosed? What if they get a disclosure that there's something on it that's a concern of theirs, and they've been asked to remove contingencies, and let's say they did remove the contingencies. What if they say, oh no, I want to cancel now? is the listing agent going to say, oh no, you can't cancel, you remove contingencies? 14B3 protects you from that. So just so you know. And so that funny became a little nugget there. So, okay, so let's move right along here. So inform lender of the transaction. Usually it is a selling agent's responsibility to communicate the transaction to the lender. Provide to the lender the required information. Have the client also communicate and deliver any necessary items to begin the loan process. Lenders are required to have your client sign lender's disclosures at this point, right? These are the things that you should be giving your lender: contracts, escrow information, listing agent information. Escrow and the lender have to communicate because escrow does what's called figures. They have to give the lender the figures in order for them to get the disclosures out. Now, disclosures are something fairly new. I would say probably the past 10, maybe 12 years. When we had the mortgage meltdown, there was something that was being floated around that called predatory lending. So they created something called disclosures for lenders. So they have to upfront or front load the buyers with that information. So they're signing on. What we used to call a good faith estimate, right, is now simply just disclosures. And that's because there's a lot more information on it, okay? But they're signing, understanding the fees and all the money that they're spending on those things in order to purchase this property, right? So those are the things that the lender would need. So this is now just the next step of the process, right? So it is important that the lender be informed about the open transaction as soon as possible, because typically a transaction relies on the loan process to close. One must also remember that the appraisal and loan approval are required in the middle of a transaction to remove contingencies or cancel the transaction. These time frames also rely on the loan process. So the faster you get that information over to the lender, the faster these things happen. And most of the time, the listing agents are really, really pressing you guys to remove contingencies quickly because they don't want to have to wait. So, and I already said what this is. I already answered this question. We could tell me what the lender's disclosures are and why do they need it? Okay, and it has to do with predatory lending. You know, back in 2007, 2008, we had the mortgage meltdown. A lot of people were pointing the finger at lenders, saying, "Oh, it's all their fault," right? Well, we all kind of know that there was other issues going on with loan insuring and 80-20 loans, you know, the 100% financing, that kind of thing, which quite frankly is predatory lending. But at the end of the day, the consumer has to bear their weight and responsibility on what happened there. So disclosures came out as a possible solution to not have the finger pointed, and we haven't had that problem since, even though a lot of those products still have reared their ugly head. But for the most part, that's what disclosures are about. So any questions or comments on informing your lender? All right. So ordering inspections. So this may include termite report, physical inspection, appraisal, and other inspections desired by the client. Please reference the BIE, which is a buyer's inspection election card form for any picky buyers. And we talked about that before. When you have a picky buyer, that BIE or buyer's inspection election actually has all the different kinds of inspections you can get on a property. There's probably like 30 of them, right? Also include the agent visual inspection, usually performed by both listing and selling agent. Most brokers require an AVID for both sides. Listing and selling is required by the state unless there is nothing to report. Now, there's only one loophole there for the AVID, and that's on the transfer disclosure statement. And some of us have seen these. So when you're filling out an AVID, if it just says, looks good, nothing to report, you know, new floor, you know, if there's really nothing on the AVID that you visually see is wrong with the property, there's no reason to fill one out. And you can mark that on the TDS, which is on page 3 of the TDS, a transfer disclosure statement, saying that there's nothing to report. Or if there's a little thing to report, like let's say there was a crack in the concrete, that's all there was, you can just write it on the TDS. There's a section, a third section, that's got some lines there that you can write something in. And it's pretty much telling the reader, hey, I didn't do an avid, but I do want to mention this one thing, right? So if no inspections are being performed, be sure to include a buyer's inspection waiver, which is the BIW, to your transaction file for home inspection and termite. So those are usually the only two items that there is a waiver that's required, mainly because it has the verbiage that's saying that those things are being recommended by your broker. And if you don't get those things, you're acting against the recommendation. So this is more of a civil disclosure, or actually more of a civil advisory. If they don't get a home inspection and they don't get a termite inspection, because these are things that are recommended by the broker, we need a waiver saying that, hey, we're recommending these things, and Mr. Buyer, you're signing that you decided not to get these things. So very important, right? Inspections, as mentioned in the TC presentation, are part of the buyer's due diligence. And when working for a buyer, it is important to mention to your client what their options are. When your client has expressed their wishes, you can then coordinate the proper professionals to get the reports disclosures as soon as possible. It is important to watch the contingency date so that your client has enough time to review, go over, and complete their decision to perform. And so they have three options, okay? Well, let's start with this. So you're pretty much letting them know, okay, hey, we're ready to order inspections, right? What do you want to do? You want to do termite? Yeah, let's do termite. Okay, I have some companies that I work with, or you might know some companies. Pick one. Oh, Alex, you know what? If you know some companies, let's go with one of them. Okay, well, here's three. Pick one of them. Okay, let's go with this one. Okay, fine. So I can call them and I can set the appointment. Same thing with home inspections, right? It's very important that you give the client the option to pick their own. You can go on the internet, you can find a potential client, potential inspector of their choosing, and they might know somebody. Okay, but most of the time they're saying, oh, actually, we'll just go with whoever you know. Okay, well, here's three, pick one. So again, you're having them choose. You're not necessarily pointing one out to them, because you do not want to be accused of steering. And we talked about this before. You do not want to steer a client to a particular service because the implication is that you're getting a kickback. Okay, and you know, a $25,000 commission or a $20,000 commission is not worth getting a couple $100 worth of kickback from a potential servicer, like a home inspector or a termite inspector. Okay, it's not worth it. So allow the client to choose. Okay, and I know I'll be honest with you, 99% of the time that's going on anyway, but it's that 1% of the time where you can get caught up in a problem. So it's just not worth it. So that said, okay, you have the contingency dates. Okay, so now you want to make sure that you get those inspectors in there quick enough so you can get the reports back. But the more important part is reviewing the reports. So you're not a professional in those things, but you're looking for the red flags. Okay, and you want to point those things out to your client. You want to say, hey, look, this was going on here. This was going on here. Okay. So now you have contractually, before you remove contingencies, contractually, and actually I think that's the question that's coming up here. What are a client's options on a contract when facing contingency removal? So yeah, that's the question. Anybody know what the client's options are? So they've done all their inspections, they've looked at the disclosures, and they're ready to make a decision. What are there's actually, I'll give you a hint. There's three options. What are the three options? Anybody? Let me take a little break on that one so you guys can think about it. What are the three options? So much talking, man, makes your voice coarse. Anybody? None of the three options? All right, so the three options are this. You can either move forward with the transaction, you can try and renegotiate, or you can cancel. So move forward, try to renegotiate, or cancel. So moving forward simply means I'm removing the contingencies. I'm okay with the value. I'm okay with the property. I'm okay with everything, all the disclosures. I'm okay with the escrow stuff. I'm okay with everything. We're moving forward. We're gonna close this thing, okay? That's the first option. The second option is, let's say the appraisal came in $5,000 short. Guess what? I'm gonna write up a request for repairs. And on the request for repairs, there's a section about reducing the price. And I'm including a copy of the appraisal so I can show them that the appraisal came in short. That's what an appraisal contingency is. Because if they don't agree, you have the right to cancel. Now, they may not agree, and that's because they don't have to. Remember, the seller doesn't have to agree to anything because your original offer was an as-is offer, right? In its present condition. But what did I say the second option was? Renegotiate. So you're renegotiating with them. You have that option, and it's in the contract. It's section 11, okay, of the contract if you're interested, okay, of the RPA. So the first one was move forward. We're moving forward. Second one is renegotiate. So let's say that there's some things that they want to get fixed. You can ask to get them fixed. And again, it's just a question. It's not a demand, right? The seller again doesn't have to do any of that stuff. But when you're using the second option, you're trying to renegotiate with them, because really what you're telling them is, hey, there's a possibility that if you don't do this, I may just cancel. So most of the time, sellers are reasonable. They understand that. So sometimes they'll meet you halfway, or maybe they'll meet you the whole way, right? And then obviously the third option would be cancel. So maybe there's just too much there. There's too much going on where the value came in too low. There's the inspection found a bunch of stuff wrong with the property. Maybe you had a plumber come out and the sewage line needed some work. And it's really just a cost benefit. You're kind of weighing the benefit and the price you're getting the property for. You have the right to cancel because you're within your contingencies. So again, move forward, renegotiate, or cancel. Those are your three options. Now, I'm breaking it down easy for you because you would have to write, or you would have to read the entire contract to understand that, okay? But it is section 11, and well, it breaks it down in different parts of the contract. But section 11 is a good one. Section 14 is another good one that talks about those things, because it's telling you the performance of the buyer. The buyer has to, sign the disclosures and give them back within the contingency period. The seller has to give the information to the buyer. It gives them additional time. All of this stuff is in the contract. It's all terms and conditions, right? So any questions or comments on that slide? All right, so let's move on to disclosures. Oops, I just did something here weird. Sorry about that. So disclosures are typically delivered by the listing agent and typically are to be delivered within 7 days of the executed contract. And again, that's something that can be changed on the contract, but the contract itself reads 7 days. Please refer to CAR website for the list of required disclosures for a transaction. Reports are delivered quite differently. The termite, title, physical inspection, natural hazard disclosure, escrow documents, home warranty, appraisal, loan disclosures, etc., are delivered most of the time by you, the agent. And that's because you're receiving them from different places. And now you're potentially either putting them in a file or emailing them to your client so they can read them, right? Reports and disclosure are not typically delivered directly to a buyer, mostly because it is important for the agent to review them for some accuracy, okay? And sometimes completeness, okay? It is recommended that most of these items be obtained prior to meeting with your client and should be reviewed, possibly corrected, and then finally endorsed by all parties. Deliver executed versions to your TC. And that's mainly because TCs can't do anything with non-executed stuff. Okay, if it's not executed, TC can't use it, right? It's always important to only deliver executed items, okay? You may also want to include a receipt for reports, which is the RFR. These are some disclosures of reports that are not mentioned on any contract. So the only reference to the delivery is the RFR, which is the receipt for reports. And that is because these are all things that are not necessarily required. A lot of times, not even escrow documents, it just depends. But again, most of the time, there's no reference of their delivery or the buyer even seeing it. So it's important to get a receipt from the buyer that they saw those reports that you in the transaction got at some point, because you don't want them to claim that they never received it, okay, or they never saw it. And if they're signing, most clients are skimming over the information, but for the most part, they're looking at that stuff. But in terms of reports and disclosures, now there are a lot of other regular disclosures that are card forms. The majority of which are boilerplate, which are just general provision, meaning that you're not filling anything out on them. There's only a few of those, but there's a lot of them that is just advising them of things. And it's rather important to read. So you're giving them some time to read those things before they sign them. Any questions or comments on that? Reviewing and understanding the reports is paramount to your client, not just receiving them. And that's important because yeah, you can get them, sign them, and then return them, but it's about reading them and understanding what they are. Now, if you know what Megan's Law disclosure is, the DVD, if you understand what that is, okay, you're signing it and you're returning it, because you don't have to read it every single time. But the point is that your client understands what that is. That there's a website that they can go to check for sexual offenders. They might have kids. That might be important to them. That's an example of one of the things that you want to do when you're looking at a file. Oh, pop quiz. What do you know? So when should the sellers or the selling agent deliver the executed disclosures to the listing agent? Talk a little bit about this, okay? And I've had agents tell me or demand, they'll say, hey, you know what? You haven't delivered the disclosures back to us yet, right? You haven't delivered the disclosures back to us yet. When are you going to deliver those? Okay. Well, it's contractual, guys. This is in the contract. Does anybody know when you're supposed to send the disclosures back to the listing agent and to the seller? What does it say in the contract? In other words, does anybody know what it says? I'm sorry, Ron, I didn't hear you.
I said as soon as possible.
Okay, well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, because you gotta give it back to them anyway, right? Even if you don't close the transaction, okay? Because the contract actually talks about, excuse me, the contract actually talks about getting reports and disclosures back to the seller, and it survives the transaction, meaning that if it doesn't close, you still got to get it back to them. So as soon as possible is not the correct answer, but there's nothing wrong with that. In other words, if you want to get it back to them as soon as possible, that's fine. Okay, let's just remember what we talked about in the last slide, and that is that you want your client to understand what they say. So you want to take maybe a little bit of extra time, but the actual answer, okay, is right here, and this is section 14B of the contract, okay, and it's a matter of days, and typically it's the same as the time you're going to remove contingencies, right? So you see it right there. Buyer has 17 days to deliver to seller signed copies of statutory and lead disclosures and other disclosures delivered by the seller. So contractually speaking, it's typically when you're going to remove the investigation contingency is when you're contracted to return those things. But again, there's nothing wrong with Ron's answer as soon as possible, because that can also mean that, hey, I had the opportunity to sit with my client. I went over all of the disclosures and they signed them. There's nothing wrong with me giving them back to them because I'm going to give it back to them anyway. Even if we cancel, I'm supposed to give them back to them. Okay. So that's the correct answer. So in other words, now the reason why I find this a little bit important is because I've had agents pretty much and listing agents yell at me, telling me, where are my disclosures? And I'm telling them, well, you know what? We're not done with everything. Because see, me personally, I don't like to sit with my client. I don't like to call them and tell them, hey, come to my office, let's go over the appraisal. And then 2 days later, I tell them, come to my office, let's go over the title report. And then 2 days later, I tell them, come to my office, I want to go over disclosures. No. Come to my office, I want to go over escrow papers. No, I want to have the entire file ready for him. Disclosures, reports, escrow information, everything. Two things are going to happen. Number one, we're going to review all that stuff. And number two, we're going to sign all of it, right? So I only have to meet them one time, possibly 2 times, okay? And so we haven't removed contingencies yet, which is usually under this time frame. But that's the reason why I will wait a little bit longer, okay? But I've had listing agents yelling and screaming at me, right? That, hey, where's my disclosures? And it's like, excuse me, but number one, you don't need them right now, okay? And number two, we're still within our contingency period. And then when I show them this, then they say, oh, I didn't know that. But the idea is that you did, okay? That's why this was important to me, okay? Because now you know that there is, contractually speaking, a delivery time set to return disclosures. And I don't use this as my my ace card against a listing agent. But I will diplomatically talk about these things with them and very kindly tell them that we still have a little bit more time. Can you please reference 14B1, right? And again, I've had listing agents yell and scream at me. When I show them this, they feel pretty dumb. I'm not trying to make them feel dumb. But the fact is that you have these little nuggets that are allowing you to win the chess game. Because let me tell you, after a couple of times that you make them feel like they just don't know what they're doing, they'll back off. And that's a nice feeling. That's a nice feeling. So typically, right around the time you're going to remove contingencies is the time you're supposed to return the disclosures. That's contractual. We talked about the different pillars, right? So we're on slide number 16, coming up on 719. So we're actually doing pretty good time here. So order conditions, covenants, and restrictions. So this has to do with CC&Rs and HOAs, right? Usually requested by escrow. These items are related to property that have an undivided interest or common elements such as condos, cooperatives, own your owns, lofts, and townhomes. These usually require fees to attain. Be sure to include these costs in your negotiations, section 7D46 of the RPA, right? So that's usually on page 3, and it talks about the different fees. So if you're dealing with a PUD or a condo, and it's funny that I didn't put PUD in there, but own your owns, right? And there's some of those in Long Beach. But be sure to address the fees and who's paying for them. And typically the seller pays for them, but sometimes the buyer might, if they're being aggressive, might be willing to pay for some of that stuff, right? And there's a section there, okay? Section D, it's 7D, talks about the HOA. And if you look at D6, this is buyer to pay for any HOA certification fee. So it doesn't even give the option for the seller to pay that, right? And then I think there was that section. So if the property has an HOA, I would recommend writing something in the counteroffer allowing release of payment to the HOA. So even though it says, who's to pay for it, all that stuff, a lot of times the seller is waiting because, they're not sure that they're going to close. You haven't removed contingencies, that kind of thing. So if you address it on a counteroffer and you talk about, okay, Mr. Seller, I need these HOA docs because guess what? That's part of disclosure, okay? You can put on a counteroffer to get the seller to pay it right away so you can get those HOA docs right away, okay? So that's something to think about because you can be in a stalemate. I've been in a stalemate just like that, where the seller didn't want to pay for the HOA docs because they weren't sure the appraisal hadn't come back yet. It's like, well, my buyer hasn't further been disclosed, and they want us to remove contingencies. I'm like, well, I'm not removing contingencies until I get the HOA docs. So make up your mind, right? So any questions or comments on that? All right, so let's move right along. Oh, so we're on final thoughts. Okay, so opening a file can sometimes be tricky and frustrating. I've included a handout that may be helpful in guiding you through some of the process. And I mentioned that to you guys earlier, that I will be sending out that handout, okay? As mentioned in the handout, not all scenarios can be illustrated or demonstrated here, but the presentation does put a nice dent in a working file. And it's because I would say the majority of what we're talking about is in a file, okay? There's going to be little anomalies, little nuances that will definitely be different in your transaction. But if you have 90% of the idea on how to work a file down, it's definitely helpful. There's actually a lot of folks that aren't on today that I wish were, because I know that they need this information. And for whatever reason, they weren't able to come on. But very important. Your office manager or broker is always a good source of information as to any problems that may arise from working a file to completion. The California Association of Realtors also has web-based information that can also shed a light on known pitfalls and even avoiding legal problems. And actually, their website is actually based on that. Okay, so if you go to their website, they have little videos and they have a lot of literature on those legal pitfalls. They also have a legal resource that is available to all board subscribers. So you can actually call in and talk to an attorney. Typically only when you have a transaction, but you're only usually calling them if you are confronted with a problem. So please join us for part 2 of the presentation. Thank you for coming. And I think I put the affiliates and resources, I put that slide on the wrong section, but it's okay. I mean, you're familiar with my information. Mr. Larry had to take off early today. He was on. There's his information, phone number, and email address. Liz, broker and also loan agent. You guys are welcome to give her a call if you need a loan approval or what have you. I definitely recommend Mr. David Plummer's platform on Saturdays. He is a real estate coach and motivator. If you listen to him on a Saturday, man, you'll be all pumped up to get out there and get some business. So that's his information. 8:15 to 9:45. There's the meeting ID and password. Feel free to take a picture of that. And then there's Shamim with Property ID. They actually sell NHD reports, which I like their platform, and also their new Max report, which includes links to the different information. So that's always good. She's a new supporter of the happy hour training. So any questions or comments from you guys? I know there's only 3 of you left. There was a larger group earlier. Maybe some of you guys didn't need that information, but you guys did vote on this. So we'll see you guys next week. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to unmute. Part 2 is a little bit more in depth in terms of actually closing the transaction. I will send out that handout in the next email, so you guys get that handout. Put it aside. It's a good reference to try to look at the chain of events that happen in a transaction. I originally put this presentation together because there were some agents that weren't familiar with the process, right? And looking at it now from a different perspective, when you look at the handout, you can get a visual You know, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel on closing a transaction, because, you know, you don't learn this stuff in real estate class. You know, they're teaching you terms, they're teaching you the language, right? But you don't learn this stuff. So that said, yeah, there's that little emoji. I don't know how you did that, that little hand emoji. I don't know, I gotta mess with that, with the system a bit, but yeah, Melissa, thanks for joining us. Ron, thanks for joining us. Robert, Sully, it's always good to see you guys. And
All righty.
what's happening?
Hey, thank you very much, Alex.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope that was helpful. So I'll see you guys next week. Look out for the handout. And again, I'm always on an hour before the happy hour training, watching the real estate rant. If any of you guys just want to join me, I'm watching it for my own entertainment, but you guys are welcome to come on, to jump on and check out the show there. You know what? I just noticed that the screen sharing is off. I wonder. Oh, there it is. Were you guys able to see the screen the whole time?
Yeah.
It was on okay, because usually there's a frame around it.
There's a frame with there's a light.
Yeah, usually. So you see the world that's on fire right now says the end.
Yes.
Okay, because usually there's a frame around it that I can see, but it's not there right now. So I thought maybe I turned it off or something. But for the most part, thank you guys for joining me, and we'll see you guys next week. If there's anything else, let me know. Again, I'll send out that handout, and if you guys want to join me on next week's show, I usually come on like about 4:55, and I'm usually here until this time. I like to finish up right around 7:30. It's 7:28 right now, so we're doing good on time. But I'll see you guys next week unless there's something else.
All right, take care.
All right, Mr. Ron, good seeing you again.
Okay, but take care now. See you.
Melissa, good seeing you. Robert and Sully, I'll see you guys next week, okay?